available for playback in the next day or so. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Steve Polzin. Steve has his master's and PhD from Northwestern. He certainly has extensive experience in the, quote, real world, including working in Cleveland and Dallas before joining CUTR in 1988. He's probably one of the longest standing CUTR employees, if not the longest standing. He's been involved with numerous TRB and APTA committees. He serves on the Journal of Public Transportation's editorial board and Transportation editorial board, as well as the Hillsborough Area Regional Transit Authority board, where he serves on the board of directors. With that, let me turn it over to Steve and get you started. Steve?
Thank you, Phil. Before you do that, could you tell folks if they do have questions, what's the appropriate means to communicate those back?
Oh, sure. If you have questions during this, just click on the Q&A at the top of your screen, and you will be able to see that you can type in your question in the box, click Ask, and that'll send it to us, and I will ask those questions of Steve after his presentation. If there are more questions afterwards, we will guarantee we'll be able to get back to you later with to try to respond to your questions as best as possible. Thank you, Steve.
Okay.
Yep.
Great, thanks. It's a pleasure to be with folks today, and a favorite topic of mine, and I see we have some fact checkers on the webcast with us today. I noticed Nancy McGuckin, who's one of the NHTS support folks for FHWA for years, and Nathan Earlbaum, one of the national experts in transportation data. So I won't be able to get away with anything here today, and several others as well, so welcome. This is a disclaimer that I often use when I talk about travel behavior and our ability to understand and forecast the future, and I remind people that we struggle to predict election winners and popular TV shows and popular Christmas gifts, and in spite of massive investments and analysis, stock pickers still struggle to beat the dartboard. So in a lot of ways, we shouldn't really apologize too much for sometimes not doing a perfect job of understanding how travel behavior is going to respond to a 5, 10, 20, 30-year future, because it is very complex. It is affected by all kinds of external factors as well as changes in culture and values, etc. So I think it's appropriate for folks to recognize that we're, and perhaps these days, in one of the most dynamic worlds as it relates to travel behavior that we've been in. I've got a series of a few quick slides here that I use it with general audiences, because these are slides where typically the public's reaction or perception doesn't really match reality. The first one is what share of travel is for work. Normally when I ask that, I'll get answers in the 30 to 50% range, and the reality is the newest data suggests it's under 20%, and in fact well under if you go by trips. If you measure that in terms of travel miles, it's a couple percent higher, but still under 20%, as I recall. And of course, if you looked at in travel time, it would probably be a little bit higher, because work trips tend to be during the peak period where it's more congested. But the days of building all of our tools and analysis just around work trip really need to be numbered, because in reality the vast majority of trip is for other purposes. Work still shapes travel, but it's no longer as influential as it's historically been. This second question here is what share of households, and I happen to have Florida on here, but you can apply it nationally as well, have no workers. And the genesis of this is the fact that we often think about transportation in the context of, jobs and houses and accessibility and concentration in urban form, etc. And even this, we typically, when I ask this of folks, they'll normally give me a single-digit percentage number. were, and in the reality in Florida it's about 30%. Nationally it's about 27%, and I believe the outlier on the high end was West Virginia. It's something like 38% of households have no workers in them. A few more percent of households have work-at-home folks, about 4 now, and I don't know if those are exclusive work-at-home households, but certainly strong work-at-home audiences. So again, the world is changing. There's an awful lot of households that aren't necessarily worried about access to employment. They might be worried about access to golf courses or beaches or hospitals or grocery stores, etc. So again, a complex world that we live in. Average commute time, again, this happens to be a picture of Florida. We're not too much of an outlier on this. The normal response I get from audiences, including, freshman transportation planners, is about 45-50 minutes. The reality is it's about 25-26 minutes these days. That's something of a constant. It's gone a minute or two per decade over the past few decades, and some folks like to think that if you go back 100 years, that was how far or how long people spent walking to work in the old days. So something of a constant that we need to keep in mind. However, if you look at international experience, we are certainly on the low end on that. Share of travel on transit, another one where perception is not necessarily like reality. Florida is an outlier here. We're about half the national average. Our transit mode share is about 1% nationwide. It's just a tad under 2% using the newest data. Obviously, that's all travel. If you stop to think about travel in peak periods to downtown New York or Chicago or Washington or something like that, you'll get numbers that are the vast majority of all travel and very large numbers. So it's important that it's highly dependent upon context, trip purpose, geography, etc., but at the national scale, a modest number. I want to talk a little bit about some logic on travel behavior that I use to kind of help shape my thinking and generating hypotheses to explore things. Then I want to talk about some of the trends that we think influence future travel demand. And then a little bit on key implications. This is really a continuation of a body of work we've been working on here, myself and with Dr. Chu, for over a couple decades now, with a growing interest in how things are changing. And each time we get new data, we, of course, explore it to try and understand what's going on. We've shaped a little framework to think about travel behavior that as it occurs through time, and basically the hypothesis is that as we've had growth in income and growth in knowledge over time, it's contributed to specialization in employment, consumption, social relationships, and time use, i.e. Job classifications have got more rich. The spouse in the household is now often in the workforce. Again, an example of specialization. Consumption has gotten far more diverse as you walk in any grocery store and recognize the diversity of choices, etc. All of that, of course, contributing to increased travel and commerce and communication. And so to the extent that these fundamental relationships hold true, we can expect continued growth in travel to capture or to leverage that growth in income and knowledge, which of course raises questions: will income and knowledge continue to grow, or will income continue to grow? A key question going forward. I use a more detailed framework to think about travel behavior. The first box that shows up is the socio-demographic conditions. These are characteristics and variables that we've used for decades to understand travel, oftentimes finding a relationship between trip generation, etc., and these characteristics, mode choice, those kinds of things. So we know a fair amount about how each of these socio-demographic characteristic influences travel. And when I think about travel, I think about local person travel, long distance tourism, and freight and commercial travel, and often travel changes in the context of trip frequency, rates, distribution, mode choice, and path. The next category, one that certainly gets lots of attention these days, is the issue of how does land use, and here's some characteristics of land use that we use to discuss it. Certainly the regional national distribution, that's one that folks don't talk about much. I think it is important and has been important in terms of influencing overall travel. Density we talk about a lot, the mix of uses, the urban form, the urban design, the layout of properties, the access to the transportation modes. Do we hide our buildings behind seas of parking, or do we put them on the roadway front so that pedestrian and transit access, for example, are advantaged? And of course, contiguousness of development. In addition to these, I've argued that we haven't really spent nearly as much time looking at the business and governance and institutional context. The whole issue of the scale of activity concentration, the classic example of that, of course, is the big box store. But it goes well beyond that as we've continued to provide all kinds of activities from healthcare to education in larger units of capacity on a given site, and all of that has an implication in terms of our transportation. Similarly, the economic structure of how we deliver services. And finally, we've got transportation supply characteristics, the normal speed, cost, safety, reliability, convenience, image, multitasking opportunities, etc. Collectively, these build kind of a framework to think more about understanding the relationships between the various factors in travel demand. And now we'll switch and talk about what's going on in some of those, tease you a little bit with some arguments or some hypotheses here. We certainly hear a lot of discussion about this issue of an aging population and its implications on travel in the future. The issue of saturation of female labor force participation, changing household composition, an interesting discussion these days, reduced immigration, slowing migration, and exhaustion of suburbanization. Have we in fact kind of plateaued in that area? In the economic area, we have a number of other phenomena that are kind of contemporary news items these days. Obviously, high unemployment, some fairly compelling evidence that we've had declining wealth, and certainly less of an opportunity to invest equity in travel and consumption. Polarization of income distribution, obviously high fuel prices, globalization of supply chains and the implications on the freight side, and again, back to the economic, the shift from incurring to paying off debt and the implications that might have on discretionary income. And then you couple those kinds of characteristics with some other things like environmental climate concerns, greenhouse gas, etc., growing congestion levels. And while we've had a respite of a few years when VMT declined and congestion seemed better, there's certainly the expectation of continued growth in congestion if the economy recovers. Some significant evolution of technologies and a host of other things. And collectively, these are contributing to our inquiries and our set of issues that face us in understanding future travel. This is a bar chart that shows the increment of travel demand change over time for each of the past several years. And it's important to realize that we went from relatively constant positive annual increments of growth for a number of years to a very steep decline epitomized by the 2008 number where we had a significant decline. And then you can see we have had some bounce back in '09, and the newest data in 2010 just came out about a week ago. It's still preliminary. It will be modified. It really kind of spiked up there more than I expected. So we'll be looking at that to see if the modified numbers are any different. But again, we've seen some relatively stable increments over time, and of course this is all with a bigger population, so it suggests a declining rate of growth over time. And then some significant, if you look to the in this area here, you can see we've had some downward trending there, and of course there is economic cycles that you can see in this data, but certainly creates some interesting perspectives on what might happen in the future. This is a couple lines on this graph. The reddish colored one is really the most interesting. The blue line is the total VMT, but the red line is VMT per capita, and again, depending a little bit on refinements in historic data, but the key point there in that data set is that we did in fact peak, it appears, in terms of personal VMT per capita in about 2004-2005 time frame, which is well before the recession and the gas price hikes, the spike in 2008. So this, raises some questions of did we reach kind of saturation on a per capita level, saturation in vehicle ownership, etc., that resulted in some fundamental changes there. And then what does that suggest going forward? And obviously we had the recession and the gas price spike here, some pickup, but again we're well below those historic levels, and certainly some legitimate questions. We've got an aging population, et cetera, as to whether or how quick we might get back to those levels. Certainly most of the forecasters are continuing to predict real growth in travel per capita, but I think there's some question as to that. This is some trend data on two fundamental characteristics of travel, both trip length and trip rate at the annual level on per person, and these are for persons 5 years old and older. And you can see we've had a break in trip rate, and also more recently a little backing off in trip length. But kind of surprising to most folks is trip length has really been relatively stable over time. So in spite of suburbanization and dispersion of activities and concentration of activities in physical scale, the trip lengths haven't grown quite as much as one might have speculated. Some of that might be because we're chaining trips and other things, but a little bit more stability in there than some folks might have expected. And then this trip rate is backing off some, which is consistent with some of the economic things and some of the other observations in terms of saturation that might be associated with aging and other things that have occurred. This is the walking mode share data, and a long-term trend downward up until about 95. And then some jumps up in '01 and '08. There's a little bit of concern as to how we can interpret that, because we became much more sensitive to walking as a mode, partly because of the health effects, as well as it as an alternative to some other forms of travel. So we've really been probing respondents much more aggressively on walk trips than was historically the case. They were simply ignored in the past. If they didn't require concrete roads, then we didn't worry about them too much. Now we do, and we count them and not try to understand them more. So it's a little hard to know, how much of this trend in the last, say, couple decades is real. But certainly with growing auto availability and other things, it's certainly legitimate legitimate to have expected the downward decline that we've seen if we go back to, say, 1969. People simply have more alternatives today, more options, and are more likely not to walk to work as they were a generation or two ago. But again, within the more recent periods, one needs to be a little bit careful on the interpretations. Here's some commuting census and American Community Survey, walking mode share for commuting, and again you can see the longer term trend here. Again, this is the reported usual mode, and we're looking to be relatively stable on ACS data as well, a slight pickup on National Household Travel Survey data. Vehicle occupancies are interesting, and as recently as this morning we were trying to understand this a little bit better. These are mileage-based vehicle occupancies, mileage weighted, and if you look at this, you will see that occupancies for overall increase just a tad more recently, but work trip occupancies continue to decline, and this is interesting in that we as much as we've kind of stopped the downward trend in bike, walk, and transit, we haven't done the same for shared ride for work. And that's a real interesting phenomenon. Is what appears to have happened in the overall occupancies is group size for very long trips went up because occupancy on a trip base actually declined, but on a miles weighted base it went up. So the data is rich and interesting, and there's lots of secrets in it as you work through it and try and understand what's going on with travel behavior. Here's the carpooling mode share trend from as well, and you can see here, this again is National Household Travel Survey data. For those of you that work with this data, you'll know that this is referred to as the 2009 NHTS. When I put it on time series graphs, I used 2008. The data was collected from March 08 through March 09, so it more or less matches 2008 calendar year, and it's also weighted to 2008 American Community Survey demographic data. So I display it as 2008 data, but it's often referred to formally as the 2009 NHTS. But again, this is the mode that really is the puzzling one, because we've continued to see declines there in car sharing in spite of what you might think with the recession and economic pressures and stuff, that there might be positive motivation to increase occupancy and share rides, and yet we're not seeing that yet. Here's transit trends, transit data trends, and there's, you can tell, several lines, several data sources that are looked at here. The evidence suggests that transit tended to hit its low point in terms of national use in the mid-90s. Some of the data series, branch that or bridge that, what was the low point. But if you look at count data as well as survey data, the mid-90s appeared to be the low point. We've had some positive upward progress in terms of transit mode share since that point in time, and that's really a contribution of two factors. One, we have grown transit use in absolute terms, and as you noticed in some of the prior graphics, we've been losing trip rates and mileage on in some, particularly the last couple years. So you couple those two with growing transit and declining VMT, and then you start to move your transit mode share a little bit when you do that. And the newest data is showing about a 1.92 transit mode share. The prior 2001 data is we adjusted it for some various characteristics like group youth and walking and some other differences that occurred from prior surveys, and ended up with a number of about 1.76 in that time period. So again, some progress here, and that's confirmed with the Census American Community Survey trend. Again, the upper blue lines are work trips. The pinkish line is all travel. So that kind of gives you a sense of where we are. It does look like we turned the corner in the last decade and a half. Some tough progress right now with challenges in terms of funding transit. Vehicle availability is an interesting aspect of travel behavior as well. Occasionally I've labeled versions of this graph as vehicle saturation or vehicle gluttony, but basically we, pre-1984 we had, fairly significant upward growth in vehicle availability, almost no matter what we used as the denominator in the calculation. More recently, things have stabilized, and we're seeing that continue. And in fact, you'll see if you look at the data over in the 09 time frame, some slight declines in vehicles per driver and vehicles per person 16 and older, and vehicles per total person. However, a constant in vehicles per worker. Well, needless to say, with the high levels of unemployment we have now, each worker is continuing to support as many vehicles, but there's less here. And this is consistent. This trend is consistent with what we've seen in both vehicle sales and scrappage rates, in terms of some decline in the vehicle fleet. And if you look at zero-car households and some of those things, those are starting to tick up as well. So there's some interesting things going on as it relates to vehicle availability. And again, we do appear to be in effect saturated. That doesn't mean everybody has as many vehicles as they'd like, but it does mean that a very significant share of the population has adequate household vehicles. There's certainly some youth and some others that would prefer more. There's also at least some speculation that the tough economic times might be starting to impact this and back us off that level of saturated vehicles that we'd seen in the past. Here's the data on zero vehicle households, and as you can see, if you use the NHTS data, you'll see a slight uptick here where there's a slight increase in zero vehicle households. And we had a number of decades with dramatic declines, and those declines were not just in share but in absolute value of zero vehicle households, and that again appears to have stabilized and reversed some. We don't know if that reverse is economic constraints or choice households simply choosing not to, or perhaps partly age distribution with increasing senior population. There may be a number of factors that are contributing to that, but an interesting observation that we'll be watching closely to try and understand how that might trend in the future. This is some data on speed, and interestingly, again, it looks like speeds in terms of the performance of the overall transportation system in terms of person miles of travel per hour. This is all modes, etc. This isn't just roadways. Obviously, it's dominated by roadways, but it's not exclusively roadways. Appears to have turned a corner from what had been periods of increasing travel speed as we suburbanized and moved to less crowded roads and built more freeway and shifted more miles to freeway and shifted away from slow modes to fast modes, to now where we're starting to see declines in travel. One of the challenges, of course, with some of this data is the National Household Travel Survey series has some relatively big gaps. So, you know, we're showing straight lines between them, but in reality, they may not be straight lines. In fact, the suspicion is that this might have dipped down and be dipping back up because we are seeing in some of our congestion indices and some other speed data the fact that speeds dipped significantly in the in that period, but are starting to or speeded up rather, excuse me, in the when VMT declined, but are now starting to revert again. So again, we do bridge some of the micro phenomenon associated with things like recession and fuel price spikes with this data. Here's some summary data, and I'm going to be cross-checking this with Nancy because we were just playing with it recently. But we try and look at what happened between 2001 survey and the 2008 survey, and in that period we're showing a population growth, you know, fairly significantly, the normal historical normal of about 1% a year. A little decline in VMT. A significant decline in VMT per capita, and that's composed of both declines in trip rates and trip length. Interestingly, the single occupant vehicle share of travel actually went up, and this is the percent of the share percent. So for those of you that dig into the numbers, that the actual in effect mode share went up about 2.4%, so it was a 16% or a 6% increase in its share, and then a decline in travel speed. So these are some of the things that are going on in travel behavior or as a result of travel behavior that kind of paint a path for where we might be headed. Another one that's very, very interesting for those of you that follow the issue of time use, we really broke the trend here with the new data. We've been on a kind of sustained period of individuals spending more and more time traveling per day, and that appears to have turned around sometime between 2001 and 2008, and that's potentially a very significant factor. And again, one can speculate is that you know, economic conditions, substitution of communication for travel, what are the causal factors, and is it likely to continue, are amongst the challenges for forecasters. This data is something we're starting to play with a little bit more. We know that not just income, which a lot of transportation planners use in analysis, but wealth is a factor in both travel and vehicle ownership. And obviously with dramatic declines in home values and IRA values, etc., wealth has really plummeted lately, and it really mirrors fairly specifically the declines in vehicle sales and to a much lesser extent the decline in travel. And there's lots of different measures of wealth and lots of questions of data quality, etc. But it's an area that we think merits some further exploration to really understand how much that is going to be a factor, and particularly when at least some economists anticipate a couple decades where the country will be, you know, paying down debt and accumulating savings as opposed to consuming savings and turning that into activities and consumption, which are travel intensive. So some potentially interesting areas there. This is a graph of the distribution of both travel, person travel and VMT by age over time, and it compares the 2001 and the 2008 data. And I realize it's a little bit clumsy to look at a graph with this much data on it, but let me draw your attention to really this side of the graph. This group here appears to be very unaffected, as it were, with things that happened between 2001 and 2008. Both their total travel and their vehicle travel seemed very, very similar in that time period. But the younger households, the kind of post-teenager on to 40-ish, appeared to be the households that really either felt the pressure or had other phenomenon or cultural effects, less autocentric, more inclined to substitute communications, etc., or perhaps more financially pressured with accumulated, college and household debt, car payments, etc. These are folks that perhaps were more living on the edge financially in their formative years, and they've perhaps been hit harder on the household or on the travel side. There may be some facts that deal with household formation and folks moving back home and doing other things like that that might be contributing factors as well. But we're seeing a pretty meaningful change in travel behavior concentrated in these groups of the overall population between 2001 and 2008, and there's a number of folks across the country that are and will continue to be looking at more detail at those particular phenomena. I want to kind of, having looked at some of the data, just make some observations again on some of the factors going forward. If you look at that box that we talked about with the socio-demographic considerations, we have analyzed the effect of the aging population, and if you go back to the previous graph, you recall that as folks age, they traveled less, and that has been a contributing factor as the baby boomers work their way up to peak travel years and now are aging out of peak travel years. That's certainly an issue. While seniors travel more than old seniors did a generation ago, they travel less than they did when they were in their peak travel years. So we do have a big cohort of people moving into the senior age brackets and will over the next couple decades, and they will travel more than their parents did at that age, but less than they did when they were younger. And some evidence and certainly a fair amount of speculation about different young adult behaviors. Again, is there location preference differences? Is there different attitude towards cars, different financial stresses? A fair amount of that's gotten legs just because it's been repeated a lot of times and hasn't really been, validated with the data. So we need to be a little bit careful. We tend to try and find a logic concept that we like and repeat it enough times, and sometimes it then takes on a life of its own. And some of this hasn't been really borne out in the data yet, but we'll be watching that closely. We've got a little bit of an interesting phenomenon going on right now where, nobody can afford to sell a house because a huge share of the public's upside down in mortgages, et cetera. And ultimately that, doesn't bode well, particularly for the work trip commute. As folks do change employment over time, they can't take the opportunity to move closer to work nearly as easily as they could have in the past. And we're expecting to see at least some increase in long-distance work commutes because people are desperate for work and they take it wherever they can find it, kind of thing, and can't afford to move. So that's a risk to increase travel demand right there. And then the one we talked about several times, income wealth impacts. There's certainly others. We are seeing some slowing in immigration. We're seeing some slowing in migration, and all of those things could have impacts on future travel demand. If you look at the system supply side, it's kind of interesting because I've done some long-range travel forecasts, and other forecasters have as well, in terms of driving long-term national policy. And oftentimes one of the things I do is ask folks, well, what are your assumptions? What do you want me to assume on the supply side? And they say, no, just give us demand. Well, demand and supply are interrelated, and we at this point perhaps know less about future supply than we have in the past. There's great deal of uncertainty as to funding levels in particular, and we've been hit hard with very rapid cost increases over the past decade. So there's some real risk as to what levels of performance will a future system be able to supply. We've in effect consumed the surplus capacity that the prior generation built. We filled up the system, so there is some risks there going forward, and energy and other costs are also factors, obviously, that we experience daily. Here's some fuel price, a logic diagram of how fuel prices can impact travel behavior. I won't get into the specifics on that, but suffice it to say that it's not a simple relationship. It does have some feedback loops and some interesting relationships, both short and long term, that influence land use. Finally, I'm going to spend a few minutes here before we wrap up with some questions talking about some land use things. Again, work trip commutes are down. Lots of households have no workers, and we've got an awful lot of impediments to moving and minimizing travel that way. Those are among the land use factors going forward that will influence travel behavior. Another related area relating to land use is in a lot of cases, today's relationships, social, professional, commerce, etc., aren't as historically place-based as they were in the past. We do have a faster, more diverse transportation system. We've got real good communications. We tend to be more mobile in our both jobs and housing than prior generations. Less social relationships are made at home because simply people aren't at home as much as they used to be. They're making those relationships at the workplace and other places through Facebook, etc. Government and business are replacing neighbors as safety nets for various functions and services, and economy of scale factors have really pressured neighborhood scale businesses and enterprises. And even now with tight municipal budgets, we're seeing that with parks closing and library closing and consolidation and etc. So all of these things suggest that the kind of the neighborhood-centric sense of community and place that a lot of people aspire to will have some very real challenges because of context conditions aren't quite the same as they were in the past. This is just some simple data on how the magnitude of some of those changes in terms of concentration of activities. Schools are about 3 times as large as they were in 1950. Consolidation of grocery stores with the very large sizes. Less hospitals than there were a generation ago, and obviously, dramatic consolidation in car dealerships. And we could go on and on with other sectors of society, healthcare consolidation in some of the clinical areas and other areas. Frequency of gas stations is down, etc. So things are changing there, which really move things to a more regional rather than neighborhood scale in terms of some of our activity patterns, the challenges. Another kind of a land use observation, this happens to be a skyline of Miami in the peak of the building boom, and if you can look closely at this grainy picture, you'll see cranes on top of most of the buildings. This is back when the construction crane was the state bird. But we're building high-end condos for fairly wealthy people in our downtowns as our high-density housing, and this happens to be a picture of tearing down a Cabrini Green in Chicago, and we're tearing down low-income, high-density housing and dispersing it. So our historic perceptions of density and travel might be changed some because the nature of who's living in dense environments is starting to change over time. Now, who knows how that plays out over time, but at least it's something that we need to pay attention to as we try and extrapolate historic empirical data to current or future conditions. Also, location preference data, there continues to persist a kind of perception that that there's an urban-centric trend that isn't borne out by this Pew Research data from January that talked about preferences, and some of the new census data that's starting to be reported on now as well suggests that at least through the decade there was continued dispersion. Now, that's not to say in the latter part of the decade there might not have been some reversion, but again, we need to be careful with looking at that data to understand what's really going on in terms of land use patterns and consumer preferences. Finally, my Florida fishermen I consult with occasionally on travel, and they were commenting on the kind of conundrum we have in public transportation, where we talk about needing density to make transit work, or needing transit to make density work. Sometimes not clear what the ultimate goal is there. Again, we'll clip through this. This just points to the magnitude of uncertainties we have going forward. I think one of the messages, understand the data well, but certainly anticipate and plan for uncertainty, because that seems to be about where we're at in terms of being able to precisely predict the future on transportation. So with that, I'll wrap up my presentation and take whatever questions folks might want to share at this point in time. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Steve. Certainly a wealth of information, and I hope everybody's had a chance to digest. And again, for those that may have joined us late, you can, in the upper right-hand corner of the 3 sheets of paper, you can download a copy of today's slides. Also in the upper kind of left-hand corner of your screen, you should see the Q&A option. Just click on that and then type in your question in this area, click Ask, and that will come to our attention, and I'll ask the questions. And we already have some in already, Steve, so here we go. All right, first question: how has single occupancy vehicle grown relative to population growth? Has the share of single occupancy vehicles of the increased population over the last 10 years reflect a potential increased growth in people using SOVs, or are they trending to use alternatives?
Again, that's one we were literally playing with this morning, trying to understand, because the single occupant vehicle share has increased. If you think, if you look at a mode distribution of 100%, and the different modes, and treat SOV as a mode, it's gone up a couple percent from, I believe it was 37.5 to 39.9 on a miles weighted basis. So yes, SOV has gone up, but so have the what we refer to as the niche modes, the bike, walk, transit, have also shown growth, and it's a lot of the SOV growth has come at the expense of shared ride, particularly for urban short trips, but that's a little bit masked because long distance trips have had a higher auto occupancy. So that's kind of what seems to be going on. No, that's one where we've really, we're surprised. The carpooling, for example, has struggled, while all the other modes that we think of as green modes or more resource efficient modes have, stabilized and shown some positive trends. Shared ride hasn't, and that's a kind of a dilemma, a conundrum as to that independence and is simply still there. Part of that might be a trade-off that people are making by grouping and chaining trips, etc. And you can't do that as well with a shared ride, at least in out-of-household shared rides. So, we need to be a little bit careful in terms of interpreting the, environmental or other consequence of that. If you can, not ride with a neighbor but accomplish 3 or 4 other purposes by stringing trips, you might come out better than had you, ridden with your neighbor to work, kind of thing.
All right. The next question is, what data sources are available for the transportation impacts of telecommuting / home-based businesses?
Okay. There may be some others that have something to share on this as well, but generally, we do have data on work at home. And that's been, in fact, one of the fastest growing commute modes. If you count that as a mode, it's up to about 4% now, and it's been growing real fast. Work at home is bigger than the sum of transit and bike walk kind of, or bike at least, and so it has been doing quite well. Some of the data sources that we use, the frequency really doesn't play to the strength of some of these trends. I think, if you look at, for example, the electronic commerce that occurred at the holiday season this year, we're still seeing some real rapid changes there. The connectedness of society and the availability of high-speed internet and the share of the population that's got comfort levels with the technology is really still changing quite rapidly. So, going forward, it's hard to say how that will play out.
All right. Our next question is, as fuel prices increase, how are travelers likely to adapt short-term versus long-term?
Well, in the long term, you hope to see changes in both household location and vehicle choice. In the short term, you see some changes in travel behavior that might include mode changes and trip chaining and foregoing trips, trip rate changes. When you look back at the last spike of 2008 and you try and diagnose what happened, the vast majority of the change was simply foregone travel as opposed to shifted travel. And that means those folks either made less trips or made shorter trips. Transit did pick up a little bit, but the transit that really benefits tends to be the express type or long distance travel. If you need to travel about 10 miles on transit to realistically save enough gas to have the differential make up for the incurred out-of-pocket costs for fare kind of thing, if you look at just out-of-pocket costs. So it's those longer trips that can potentially benefit from longer trips might shift to transit in urban areas, but generally it's foregone travel and the higher short-term elasticity. The other thing on travel response to fuel prices, there are other factors in there, perceptions of how long-term it is, sensitivity to is it a international conflict issue, or is it an environmental issue, or whatever. All of those do kind of start to influence people's behaviors as well. So it's not just a pure price factor.
Okay, Steve, given you also teach graduate level courses here at USF, I thought this would be a very pertinent question to you too. What could be a very good master's thesis topic for a student struggling to find a topic on trend in travel demand, and what data sets should he or she start with?
Okay. Well, the National Household Travel Survey, which is available online with documentation and handy tools and a host of literature and lots of documents exemplifying analysis historically, is a great source. It's a rich data set. It has just dozens and dozens of questions, some of which go well beyond anything we've covered at all today, and including things about availability of internet at your home and whether you drive hybrids, etc. So that's a rich topic area for research.
And Steve,
census data is more limited, but still available as well.
And Steve, I understand there's an NHTS conference in June. Do you have any more?
There will be an NHTS conference in June in Washington to share research results, and there will be electronic proceedings available for that on the web, and that's TRB sponsoring that. You can find links to that on the TRB websites as well, and FHWA hosts all of the NHTS materials, and again, just a wealth of stuff there. There are other sources. Like I said, we do use census. We also use field count, hard data to kind of validate some of the trends in terms of what's going on.
All right, Steve, we have a couple more questions to squeeze in here in the last couple of minutes to make sure we respect everybody's time. The next question is the number of highway deaths has gone from about 42,000 in 2007 to about 32,000 in 2010. Any thoughts as to why from a travel standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge there is to try and dice out all of the contributory factors, and there were declines in encouraging declines the last couple of years in terms of safety, and certainly VMT declines contributes to that, and arguably, incidents are probably non-linearly related to VMT, because as VMT grows, the opportunities for conflicts grows probably exponentially relative to volumes. So VMT is a factor, but there's a lot more than that. I mean, we're still benefiting from a pipeline of technology improvements in the vehicles in terms of airbags and seat belts and crush zones, etc. And I think we're seeing a lot of that as well. And then there's the whole issue of substance abuse, etc., related safety and pedestrian awareness. And so I think there's a number of things that are coupled together there. VMT is a factor, but a relatively modest one in terms of understanding the full nature of change.
Okay. Kind of talking about change, the next question is, do you feel that the green trend, cleaner air, less pollution, et cetera, has had any impact on the trends you've been talking about? And if not, do you think it ever will?
Yeah, I do think it has some influence, because a lot of the, for example, somebody asked about response to gas price. Well, there may be people that are responding to gas price not because it's an affordability issue, but because they're upset about supporting international entities and or from a pure environmental perspective. So I do think it's a factor, and I do think that there's folks that choose transit and choose bike and walk, etc., not for any of our traditional socio-demographic reasons, but because of their valuing their contribution to helping the environment. So I think it's there. My suspicion is it's modest. If it were real significant, we'd see bigger changes in trends, and the reality is the trends aren't changing very rapidly. And I think over time, if there's verification of some of the environmental consequences, that yes, we'll see more and more folks responding appropriately. As we've had kind of unusual seasonal weather the last 2 years, and depending on the kind of your perception, since it was cool winters, if they'd have been real hot winters, then we might have had more people saying, "Yep, time to get serious," and so it's hard to second guess, but I think it'll be a factor going forward, absolutely.
Okay. We'll have some more questions, and we will go ahead and take those, but for those that have to leave, I realize we're at about our 1 hour limit. If you would take a minute and complete the online evaluation while we continue to go through the evaluations, we would really, the remaining questions, excuse me, we would greatly appreciate it. And our next one, as you may have seen, was scheduled 2 weeks from today. I'll talk about the American Community Survey Statistical Analyzer by Dr. Xiao Chu. It's a spreadsheet tool to help people analyze what is essentially what are the true differences that might be found in the data, and help for those that like to use the data. It's a very helpful spreadsheet tool, free for downloading as well. So all right, let's with that, Steve, let's go back to some of these. There are about 3 more in the queue right now, and then we'll call it a day. Do you know how the VMT per capita numbers have behaved within or outside major urban areas? I'm curious if congestion within the urban areas could suppress VMT per capita growth there.
We have looked at that. I need to go back and look at the data before I commented on that in more detail. I do think the congestion consequence of has been real, and going forward could be very significant. If we choose not to continue to invest in transportation capacity, it's going to have a consequence because we filled up our system and to a certain extent. So I think perhaps less so right now, but certainly going forward, that's a huge issue. If we don't provide the capacity, it's going to constrain VMT at some point, particularly in the urban areas.
Our next question, a number of studies indicate that housing in more walkable neighborhoods has fared better than in less walkable areas. For example, losing less value, sustaining or increasing value. How has that affected changes in travel behavior in suburban versus urban areas?
Yeah, let me comment on that. I would issue a great deal of caution on that because a lot of these observations are kind of aggregate observations, and the reality is in those areas where there were significant increases in dwelling units, where many of the homeowners were buying with little equity and high debt levels, etc., those are areas that got hit hardest by the turnaround. Since much of our urban transfer, much of our housing stock gets built in the suburbs, those are the areas where you see a neighborhood with literally half the homes vacant. People were buying, highly leveraged, little equity. Younger folks that were newer in their job had less job security, higher probability of being laid off, etc. So those are areas that got slammed, and I'd be careful drawing the conclusion that they got slammed because transportation costs were higher or something like that. It's simply because there was a high concentration and the consequence of foreclosures and highly leveraged folks. I think if you look at some concentration of urban condos, they had the same consequence. If you look at the housing stock in Miami, for example, and other urban condo, they got slammed too. And again, it had to do with the magnitude of increase in supply relative to the overall totals in the broader market segment that you're looking at. So I'm not there yet in terms of willing to draw that association. I'd want to see a little bit more compelling data and longer term data that was adjusted for a number of other factors before I was willing to reach those conclusions.
Okay. And the last question for today is, at the University of California, Irvine, we have a program to partially subsidize a year of unlimited subscription to the county transit authority's bus routes. Historically, we've seen major spikes in gas prices increase utilization of this subsidy, such as in 2008. Most recent data shows that the population isn't reacting so quickly to the gradual rise in gas prices, even as they approach 2008 levels. Have you seen similar patterns showing a lack of expected response to gas prices without change in mode switch?
I do think that part of the differential response is that it's still real early to measure that, for one thing. I mean, we don't have VMT data back yet. We've had a 33-cent gas price spike in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And I do think there's also a fatigue effect where, people have been hearing about these, they come, they go, they don't necessarily take them seriously, or in some cases they have responded, and more folks have small cars and hybrids, et cetera, than they did in the past. So in some ways people have adapted to higher prices, and so they're perhaps less vulnerable. In other cases they've got thick skin and they're used to these cycles, or they're cynical about them and they don't respond. Again, it's a little bit earlier. I think we need a little bit longer time frame. What's really kind of intriguing is how inelastic the travel demand is. is. We oftentimes search the data to scour for very, very modest changes, and it is fairly resilient to context. It's amazing.
Well, Steve, I thank you, and I think we probably needed a longer-term aspect for today's presentation as well.
Well,
so,
thanks, folks.
Thanks to everybody for attending, and again, if you take a minute to completely to fill out that evaluation on form, we greatly appreciate it. And again, we hope to see many of you back in about 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.